The exciting scene had drawn everyone out to the streets to see the missionaries who had just disembarked after 3 months of navigating the seas. All that the missionaries would talk about that day was the great joy they felt when they stepped on the soil for the first time, welcomed by a grandiose procession organized by the friars throughout the city of Manila. The young friars had left their country, Spain. Just 10 months earlier, they had crossed the Atlantic from Seville all the way to Veracruz. They traveled cross-country for about 800 kilometers from the Atlantic coast to the other side of the peninsula, facing the Pacific with a stopover in Mexico City. Upon arriving at Acapulco, they embarked on board the Manila galleon. For decades, this had been the voyage itinerary for the Augustinian Recollects friars heading towards the Philippines as missionaries. When they reached the port of Manila, the missionaries were taken in procession throughout the city streets, starting from the Pasig River docks and culminating at the doorsteps of the Convent of Saint Nicholas, located at the southeast corner of Intramuros. For about 340 years, the Convent of Saint Nicholas in Intramuros was the hub of the Augustinian Recollects missions. It was home to some 2,000 Recollects missionaries, a training ground where they had their first encounter with the Filipino culture, a formation house for young friars aspiring for the priesthood, and a hospice for the sick religious, and the final resting place of those who passed away. The foundations of the convent were laid in 1608, and in 1945, during the Second World War, it was bombed and reduced to rubble. This documentary is presented in homage to all the friars who dedicated their lives to Christ, the Church, the Order of Augustinian Recollects, and the Filipino people. The Augustinian Recollects arrived in the Philippines in 1606. 2 years after, they founded and dedicated a convent under the patronage of Saint Nicholas of Tolentine within the walled city, close to the civil, military, and religious administrative buildings. Today, this colonial walled area, famously known as Intramuros, is just one of the 16 districts of Metro Manila. The Saint Nicholas Convent we see in the photograph was the last form of the building after it underwent 4 massive renovations under the care of the Augustinian Recollects. Its back wall was set next to the city wall. Today, the Manila Bulletin headquarters sits exactly in the area where the convent used to stand. Let us get on our virtual time machine to visit the convent. At the intersection of Cabildo and Recoleto streets, we are amazed by a remarkably high bell tower majestic, beautiful, solid, and elegant, may be the most imposing belfry in the area. The tower probably comes from the original building in the 17th century. It is made of bricks and limestones mixed with mortar. The three-layered base of the tower was so strong that it still stands today, having withstood the poundings and tests of time. The Baroque church was made of solid bricks, measuring 55 meters long and 13 meters wide. The Latin cross-shaped foreplane had Solomonic columns. The longer transept used to house the Nazareno chapel. The main facade was decorated with a niche bearing the image of Saint Nicholas of Tolentine. During the feast days, hundreds of candles would illuminate the facade, virtually converting the church into a marvelous lighthouse. When electricity began to be used in 1906, the spectacular effects was amplified by light bulbs. The Church of Saint Nicholas had never been a parish, but it was teeming with pastoral activities and liturgical worship. Hundreds of faithful and devotees listened to famous preachers, some of whom had been declared by the Church to be saints, such as Melchior of St. Augustine and Ezekiel Moreno. The Recollects were particularly keen on liturgical worship. St. Nicholas Church had 5 processional floats, and the liturgical ornaments were of the highest quality. The meticulously decorated chasubles, dalmatics, and capes bearing the order's emblems have survived to our day. These priceless vestments are now displayed in this convent in Marsilia, Spain. Together with this chalice, known as the Chalice of the Province, for its engraved depictions of the seal of the order and the images of Saint Nicholas, the partridge, and the star. This other silver chalice is exhibited in the Recollect Museum in Quezon City, some 16 kilometers from Intramuros. Leo XVIII used it for its priesthood jubilee. He offered it as a gift of appreciation after receiving a special present from the province of Saint Nicholas and the Arts Confraternity of the Nazarene of Intramuros. In the same museum, we can also find this image of the Archangel Saint Michael, made of ivory, which for centuries was enthroned in the highest part of the main altar piece. This image of Our Lady of Good Health was venerated in Intramuros. It was brought from Mexico in 1634 and is now displayed in the Recollect Museum in Quezon City. The image of the child Jesus is also made of ivory, and so are the hands of the Virgin Mary. She is dressed in a chiseled metallic mantle and rhinestones. Also of great importance for worship was the church pipe organ, built by the Augustinian Recollects friar, Padre Diego Serra, in 1798. The magnificent frontage of the organ, its console and steps, were in the high grandstand at the right wing of the altar. The pipes were installed around the corners, topped with the image of an angel playing a musical instrument. When the organ was played, the harmonious sound would reverberate in the entire church like a grandiose orchestra. Sadly, in 1898, when the American troops used the church to imprison some 1,500 Spanish soldiers, the monumental pipe organ was abandoned. Next to the Nazarene Chapel was the well-built Pantheon. During the Second World War, the place was converted into a safety vault to hide and protect what was salvaged from the bombings of 1945. The remains of the deceased Recollects were eventually transferred to San Sebastian Church, which is just about 2 kilometers from Intramuros. The Baroque altarpiece was plated with gold and adorned with sculptures of the saints of the Augustinian family, interspersed with 6 paintings in wooden panels depicting the life of Saint Nicholas and the miracles he performed. At the helm was the imposing statue of the saint that was brought to the Philippines by the first Recollect missionaries. Every year, on the 10th of September, this image of Saint Nicholas would be mounted on a silver processional float and taken out for procession around the city. Thousands of bread rolls were distributed to the people. The statue of Saint Nicholas of Tolentine had a silver platter and a golden partridge. In 1948, these were melted and molded into a halo, which was then crowned to Our Lady of the Way, which until today is venerated in the Novitiate Convent in Monteagudo, Navarre, Spain. This image of Our Lady of Consolation was also brought to the Philippines by the first Recollect missionaries. It was mounted at the front side of the altar, facing the right nave. This imperial crown of Our Lady of Consolation is made of fine gold adorned with valuable gemstones. The Recollect friars managed to save this precious crown, and on the 22nd of September 1954, it was used to crown the statue of Our Lady of the Way in Monteagudo. This giant fresco on the right side of the transept was painted by the artist Rafael Enriquez Villanueva, the first director of the Academy of Fine Arts in Manila. It portrayed the declaration of Saint Joseph as the patron saint of the Church. The devotion to Saint Joseph in Saint Nicholas Intramuros traced its roots back to the very foundation of the convent itself. Brother Casildo Caballero, an Augustinian Recollects friar, promoted fervently the devotion, captivating national interest, so that in the 19th century, the priory was even known as the Convent of Saint Joseph. Another important statue brought by the Recollects to the Philippines was a life-size image depicting a dark-skinned Jesus Christ who fell while carrying the cross on the way to Calvary. Known in the Philippines as the Black Nazarene, it was carved by an unknown sculptor in Mexico in the 16th century. Its popular devotion yielded the birth of a highly active lay confraternity which supported many important missionary and social projects in Mindanao. The original image was lost. However, an exact copy of the statue is enshrined in the nearby Quiapo Church, and its arrival is commemorated annually on the 19th of January with massive procession attracting millions of devotees. Saint Lucy had an altar for herself that had also drawn hundreds of devotees. Unfortunately, the statue was lost in 1945, along with the destruction of the altar of relics, famously known for its rich collection of sacred objects. They contained relics of the late Japanese martyrs who were sent by the Recollect friars to Japan. Later, the missionaries themselves were also martyred in 1632. Adjacent to the church was the 3-story convent. The basement up to the 2nd level was built out from bricks and limestones, while the upper portion was made of lighter wooden materials. The main door was decorated with an imposing arch. The pathway to the garden square cloister headed to a lobby adorned with beautiful paintings depicting the life of Saint Nicholas of Tolentine. Marian altar pieces could be found in the 4 corners of the altar. The structure was ordered according to functions. The lower level, or the ground floor, contained the common areas. The second level housed the seat of the province, and the third served as quarters for friars still in the stage of formation. All the floor levels were connected by a majestic wooden staircase. The handrail was made from Molavi wood, often utilized to make Spanish galleons. In one of the stairs landings, there used to be a priceless statuette of the Casiguran crucifix. Legend tells of a Recollects friar who was in danger of death as Muslim pirates attacked the little town of Casiguran. Alone and without other priests to confess to, he decided to tell his sins to the crucified Christ. The story goes that Christ freed his hand from the nail to give him absolution. This jewel relic was conserved by the Recollects, and today it can be found and admired in the Recollects Museum at Quezon City. The common areas on the ground floor, or the sacristy, library, passageway to the church, the kitchen, the refectory was equipped with a pulpit where readings during meals were done. The library contained a rich collection of books that were brought in little by little by about 140 boatloads. In July of 1618 alone, more than 3 tons of books and liturgical garments destined for Intramuros were transported in Manila galleon. Some of these books were saved by the Recollects friars during the Philippine Revolution and are now conserved in Ribeirão Preto in Sao Paulo, Brazil. The convent used to host between 20 to 30 friars. The second floor housed the rooms of the priests and the infirmary, where missionaries needing medical care was treated. Access to the choir loft was also found on this floor. The wing facing Cabildo Street was designated to be the official seat of the province, containing the rooms of the Father Provincial and his councillors, offices, archives, and the administrative and meeting rooms. This portion of the house embodied the control booth which guided the ship of the entire province. It was from here where vital decisions for the care of 160 parishes in 28 different islands of the Philippines were made. Over the centuries, the decisions made in this booth had reached as far as China, Spain, England, Mariana Islands, Italy, Japan, Mexico, Trinidad, Peru, and Venezuela. Thankfully, much of the documentations generated and safeguarded in the Convent of Intramuros were saved from destruction and were conserved in the Convent of Marsilia, Navarre, Spain, in the early 20th century. Today, it is one of the most important Filipino archives in Europe. Among the many important books, it boasts of the Book of Professions dating back to the 1600s. Its pages contain the signatures of hundreds of Recollects friars the day they made their profession of vows to live a life of poverty, chastity, and obedience. The recent restoration allows us to browse those pages and capture the unwavering resolve and commitment of thousands of Recollects friars who gave their lives for the Church and the Order. The novitiate was situated on the 3rd floor along with the rooms of young professed religious still under formation in preparation for the priesthood. There was also in this area a common space called Las Vistas, or the view, because with its open sides, the panoramic view of the city and its skyline could be enjoyed, and the fresh marine breeze could be felt. Some 2,000 friars had lived in Saint Nicholas Convent of Intramuros through its more than 3 centuries of existence. Some are now declared saints by the Church, like the Martyrs of Japan, several Martyrs of Motril in Granada, Spain, and Saint Ezekiel Moreno. Others were named bishops. Some were designated in the Philippines, like Juan Ruiz de San Agustin, Joaquin Incabo, Jose Aranguren, Mariano Cuartero, Leandro Arue, Andres Ferrero, and Gregorio Espiga. Others were appointed bishops in other countries, such as Toribio Mingelia, Saint Ezequiel Moreno, Francisco Javier Ochoa, Arturo Quintanilla, and Martin Ligara. Many Augustinian Recollects who live in Intramuros have left a legacy to the Filipino culture. Many were philologists and translators. Juan Romero de la Concepcion wrote the first history of the Philippines in 14 volumes. Juan Felix de la Encarnacion printed a Visayan-Spanish dictionary, which is still referenced today. Gregorio Fidel de Blas drew some maps of the Philippine Islands so precise that the Japanese seized all the copies they found during the Second World War. And Francisco Sadaba made a complete list of all the Recollect friars who served in the Philippines from 1606 to the beginning of the 20th century. Being the hub of the province of Saint Nicholas of Tolentine for centuries, the Convent of Intramuros became the epicenter of major decisions which played a decisive role in the history of the order. At the height of the Philippine Revolution, 34 Recollects were martyred and 85 others were imprisoned. The rest of the missionaries sought refuge in few safer convents as they awaited decisions from the superiors. On the 19th of August 1898, a decision was taken in Intramuros to open new missions in America. In hindsight, it was a decision that would change the course of history in the life and mission of the order. Not only did it save the Recollection from definitive extinction, it opened new horizons for the order to expand and establish in 21 countries until today. After the Revolution, the Convent of Intramuros had lost the seat of leadership within the Recollection. Its last glorious year was in 1937, when the church was remodeled and hosted some of the events of the International Eucharistic Congress in Manila. Father Domingo Carcelier, Augustinian Recollect, won the first and the second prizes in the composition contest for the official hymn of the Congress. These hymns are still sung today in the Philippines. That same year, another Augustinian Recollect friar, Francisco Javier Ochoa, was ordained Bishop of Quete, China. 4 years later, in 1941, the first batch of Filipino friars made the religious profession after finishing their novitiate in Intramuros. Since then, the Asian lifeblood, both Chinese and Filipino, continued pouring into the order copious vocations and apostolate. Intramuros, then, was awaiting its final days, a last act worthy of Greek tragedy in which cruelty becomes heroism and bloodshed opens new horizon of hope. The Second World War was at its peak. The Allied forces were recovering the Philippines from the Japanese forces, one island after another. On the 3rd of February 1945, the Japanese were besieged within Intramuros and were bombarded intensely and systematically by the Allies. But the Japanese held their ground and murdered about 10,000 civilians. Six Recollects friars were captured along with 125 Spaniards, more than half of whom were religious. They were placed in a bomb shelter, and after closing the vents, the Japanese blew the enclosure with grenades, leaving behind just one survivor. The six martyrs of Saint Nicholas in Intramuros were Mariano Alegria, who was the prior of the community, Hernan Burun, Juan Machicote, Pedro Crespo, Angel Peña, and Ildefonso Visga, the sacristan who hid in the burial chapel the sacred images and objects which we can see now in the museums of Marsilia and Monteagudo in Spain and Bulwagan Recoletos in Quezon City, Philippines. After the American bombings, and with the Japanese burning down everything, the walled city was reduced to rubble, and along with her was the prestigious convent and church of Saint Nicholas. Reconstruction could have been possible, but extremely expensive. The American military eventually demolished what was left of it. The large bell, what's ironically called the bomb, was stolen using only frail bamboo scaffoldings. How it was done remains a mystery today. Amidst the ruins, however, there was a ray of hope for Saint Nicholas of Intramuros. The order was offered compensation for the loss and the sale of the compound. The beautiful convent and the church may never be rebuilt again, but the proceeds of the said offering were used by the Augustinian Recollects to build the first ever university in the history of the order, the University of Negros Occidental Recoletos, or UNOR, in Bacolod City. From the rubbles, the great sufferings and bloodshed, the seed of the gospel has survived and continues to grow in the fertile soil of the educational institution which until today offers dignified future and Christian education for thousands of Filipinos.